I always knew I was the invisible daughter. While my sister Charlotte dazzled everyone with her perfect smile and designer clothes, I was just Maya, the one who showed up on time, paid her bills, and worked in what my family lovingly called the most boring profession on earth. Tax auditing. Oh, how they laughed about that at dinner parties. Maya works for the IRS, my mother would say, with that particular tone she reserved for discussing root canals or traffic violations. She audits people's taxes. Can you imagine anything more dreadful? The guests would chuckle politely while I sat there, picking at my salad, wondering why I kept showing up to these gatherings where I was treated like a punchline. Charlotte, on the other hand, was studying fashion design at a prestigious art school. Every family gathering became a showcase for her latest creation or her newest boyfriend who always seemed to own something impressive like a yacht or a tech startup. I'd listen to her animated stories about gallery openings and Fashion Week while I calculated tax deductions in my head, a habit I'd developed to cope with social situations. The irony wasn't lost on me that while they mocked my profession, I was the only one in the family with actual financial stability. Charlotte lived off our parents' generosity and student loans she had no intention of paying back anytime soon. My mother hadn't worked in 15 years, preferring to focus on her wellness journey and book club meetings. And my father, well, Dad was drowning. I discovered the extent of his financial troubles purely by accident. I'd stopped by the house to drop off some documents he'd asked me to review, thinking it was just his usual request for help with tax paperwork. Instead, I found him sitting at the kitchen table at 2 p.m, still in his pajamas, surrounded by a mountain of bills and foreclosure notices. "Dad?" I set the papers down carefully, my auditor's eye immediately scanning the chaos before him. "What's going on?" He looked up at me with eyes that had aged 10 years since I'd seen him last month. The successful businessman who'd raised me to believe that hard work and integrity were the foundations of success looked broken. "The business failed, Maya. Everything's gone." The construction company he'd built over 25 years had collapsed, almost overnight when his business partner embezzled funds and disappeared. Dad had signed personal guarantees on everything, which meant when the company went bankrupt, so did he. The house, the cars, even my mother's jewelry would have to go to satisfy the creditors. "Does Mom know?" I asked, though I already suspected. The answer: I can't tell her. Not yet. She's so excited about Charlotte's upcoming graduation, and you know how she gets about appearances. He gestured helplessly at the foreclosure notice dated just 3 weeks away. "I keep thinking maybe I can figure something out." I stared at that notice, doing rapid calculations in my head. The amount owed wasn't insurmountable, not for someone with my income and savings. I'd been living modestly for years while my salary grew, putting money away because I'd learned early that financial security was the only security that mattered. What if I helped? The words came out before I'd fully processed the decision. "Maya, no, I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking. I'm offering." I picked up the foreclosure notice, noting the precise amount needed to bring the mortgage current. "I can cover this." That's how it started. One payment to stop the foreclosure, then another to catch up on property taxes. Then the roof needed repairs after a storm, and the furnace died in the middle of winter. Each time, I told myself it was temporary. Dad would get back on his feet, find a new job, maybe start a smaller company. Each time, I'd transfer money from my savings account while my family remained blissfully unaware that I was single-handedly keeping their world from collapsing. I never told them. What would have been the point? They saw me as reliable, practical, Maya, who worked her boring job and lived her quiet life. They didn't need to know that their quiet, boring daughter was actually quite good at her quiet, boring job and had been promoted 3 times in 5 years. They didn't need to know about the bonuses or the consulting work I did on weekends that had built my savings account into something substantial. Meanwhile, life went on as normal for everyone else. Charlotte graduated with honors, and immediately, started planning her post-graduation European tour. Mom joined a new yoga studio and began talking about getting a life coach. Dad pretended to look for work while actually spending most days in his home office, playing solitaire and drinking coffee that I was unknowingly paying for. I became an expert at creative bill management. I set up online accounts for all their utilities and major expenses, routing the payments through my checking account while arranging for the statements to still show Dad as the account holder. It wasn't difficult. I was, after all, professionally trained in financial systems and had helped plenty of clients organize their affairs. The mortgage company was happy to work with me once I proved I could make consistent payments. I even negotiated a better interest rate. Within 18 months, I'd brought everything current and was actually paying ahead on the principal. The house that my parents thought they were about to lose was not only safe, but building equity faster than it had in years. Still, no one knew. At family dinners, Dad would make vague references to getting things sorted out, while Mom planned Charlotte's elaborate birthday parties and weekend getaways with her book club friends. Charlotte regaled us with stories from her European adventure. Funded partly by Dad's credit cards that I was quietly paying off each month, I told myself I was being noble. This was what family did for each other, right? I was the one with the stable income and no dependents. Of course I should help. But as months turned into years, a quiet resentment began growing in my chest, like a tumor I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just the money. Though watching my savings account shrink while my family's lifestyle remained unchanged, certainly stung. It was the casual dismissal of everything I'd worked for. At Charlotte's birthday party, Mom introduced me to her friends by saying, "This is Maya, my practical daughter. She works for the government doing tax things. Thank goodness Charlotte got the creative genes." I smiled and nodded like I always did, but something twisted in my stomach. These people had no idea that the woman they were dismissing as practical was the reason they were enjoying appetizers in a house that should have been foreclosed on 2 years ago. The mortgage payments weren't even the worst part. When the kitchen needed updating because Mom was embarrassed by the dated appliances, I paid for a $15,000 renovation. When Charlotte needed a car after her graduation gift, Volkswagen proved totally unreliable. After 6 months, I quietly handled the down payment for her Honda. When Dad's depression led to some expensive retail therapy, I covered the credit. Card bills without saying a word. Each transaction felt like swallowing a small stone. The weight in my chest grew heavier, but I kept telling myself this was temporary. Eventually, Dad would find his footing. Eventually, my sacrifices would be acknowledged. Eventually, I'd matter as much to them as they apparently mattered to me, but eventually never came. If anything, they seemed to take my stability for granted even more as time passed. I became like the reliable old car that always starts, so predictable that you stop appreciating it and start assuming it will always be there. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in March. I'd had a particularly challenging day at work, dealing with a client who'd tried to claim his golf membership as a medical expense, followed by a 3-hour audit that revealed systematic fraud spanning 4 years. I was exhausted, both mentally and emotionally, when my phone rang. Maya. "Sweetie, can you come over? We have exciting news." Mom's voice carried that particular bubbling enthusiasm she reserved for Charlotte's achievements. I found them all gathered in the living room when I arrived, champagne glasses in hand, and expressions of barely contained excitement on their faces. Charlotte was practically vibrating with joy, her left hand extended to show off a ring that caught the light like a small star. "I'm engaged," she squealed, launching herself at me for a hug that smelled like expensive perfume and happiness. The ring was gorgeous, I had to admit. A vintage Art Deco setting with a center diamond that had to be at least 2 carats, surrounded by smaller stones that complemented Charlotte's delicate features perfectly. Her fiancé, James, was a successful marketing executive who owned a condo downtown and drove a BMW. On paper, he was everything my parents had hoped for in a son-in-law. "When's the wedding?" I asked, accepting a glass of champagne I didn't really want. October, Charlotte clasped her hands together. We want a fall wedding, maybe at the Riverside Country Club. James's family knows the manager, and we think we can get a really good deal on the venue. I nodded along as they described their preliminary plans. 200 guests, a full orchestra. Charlotte's dress would be custom designed by one of her professors who had connections to Milan. It sounded beautiful and expensive and exactly like the kind of wedding Charlotte had been planning since she was 12. The only challenge, Dad said, clearing his throat slightly, is the budget. Weddings these days cost more than my first house. Which is why we've been thinking, Mom added, her eyes bright with the solution they'd clearly already worked out, about selling the house. My champagne glass stopped halfway to my lips. Selling the house? It makes perfect sense, Mom continued. We've got all this equity just sitting here, and honestly, this place is too big for just your father and me now that you girls are out on your own. We could downsize to a nice condo and use the difference to give Charlotte the wedding she deserves. Charlotte bounced slightly in her seat. Plus, James and I could use part of it for a down payment on our own place. We've been looking at this adorable townhouse in Oakwood that would be perfect for starting a family. I set my glass down carefully, my hands suddenly unsteady. You want to sell the house to pay for the wedding? Among other things, Dad said. The real estate market is strong right now, and this neighborhood has really appreciated. We should be able to clear at least $300,000 after paying off the mortgage. $300,000. The mortgage that I had been paying for the past 5 years. The mortgage that had been reduced from its original amount because of all my extra principal payments. The mortgage that, according to my last statement, review, would be completely paid off in just 18 more months. Maya, you're being awfully quiet, Charlotte observed. Don't you think it's exciting? I looked around the room at my family's expectant faces. These people who had lived in this house for the past 5 years without ever questioning how they'd avoided foreclosure. These people who'd enjoyed every upgrade and repair without wondering where the money came from. These people who were now planning to sell a house they didn't even own anymore. It's definitely surprising, I managed. We know it's a big change, Mom said, reaching over to pat my knee. But change can be good, right? Your father and I are excited about the possibilities. And honestly, Charlotte added with a laugh, it's not like you could contribute to the wedding anyway. No offense, Maya, but government salaries aren't exactly known for being generous. This way, everyone wins. There. It was the casual dismissal that had become so familiar, I almost didn't notice it anymore. Almost. But tonight, with 5 years of mortgage payments and renovations and repairs fresh in my mind, it hit differently. Tonight, it felt like a slap. You're right, I said slowly. I couldn't possibly contribute anything meaningful. I left early, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely false. As I drove home to my modest but comfortable apartment, I couldn't stop thinking about that phrase. Everyone wins. Everyone except the person who'd actually been keeping their world afloat for half a decade. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and making a decision that had been building in my subconscious for months. I was done being invisible. I was done being taken for granted. And I was absolutely done pretending that my family's casual cruelty was somehow acceptable because they didn't know better. They were about to find out exactly how much their boring, practical daughter had been contributing to their lives. And they were going to find out in front of everyone who mattered to them. The engagement party was set for the first Saturday in May, giving Charlotte and James 6 weeks to plan what Mom described as a proper celebration of their commitment. The guest list grew from 50 to 75 to over 100 as Charlotte remembered more friends from art school, James added colleagues from work, and Mom invited everyone from her book club, yoga studio, and the country club where Dad still maintained his membership despite his supposed financial difficulties. I watched the preparations with a mixture of fascination and growing anger. They spared no expense, hiring a caterer who specialized in elevated comfort food, and a florist who created arrangements that cost more than most people's monthly salary. The party would be held in the backyard of the house I'd been secretly maintaining under a tent that cost $3,000 to rent for one evening. "Maya, we need to talk about your outfit," Charlotte announced during one of my increasingly reluctant visits. She'd laid out several options on her bed, all designer pieces that had never seen the inside of a discount store. "I know fashion isn't really your thing, but this is important. There will be photographers, and I want everyone to look their best." I stared at the clothes, each one probably worth more than I spent on my entire wardrobe in a year. "I'll find something appropriate. Maybe we could go shopping together? I saw this adorable dress at Nordstrom that would be perfect for you. It's professional looking but still feminine. Very you. Professional looking. Very me. Code for boring. And forgettable, the human equivalent of beige wallpaper." "That sounds great," I lied. The week before the party, I did something I'd never done before. I went shopping for an outfit that was decidedly not very me. I found a dress that was bold, without being inappropriate, elegant without being understated. I got my hair done at a salon that Charlotte frequented, where the stylist seemed surprised that I wanted something more dramatic than my usual conservative style. I also spent considerable time preparing what I privately called the documentation. 5 years of bank statements, mortgage records, repair receipts, and renovation contracts. I organized everything chronologically and made copies of the most important documents. My auditor training had taught me that evidence was only as good as its presentation, and I wanted my presentation to be flawless. Most importantly, I made sure all my legal documents were in order. The house had been transferred to my name 18 months earlier, when I'd refinanced the mortgage to get a better rate and decided it was time to protect my investment. Dad had signed the paperwork, without reading it carefully, trusting his practical daughter to handle the boring financial details. The irony wasn't lost on me that his dismissive attitude toward my expertise had made my eventual revenge possible. I also consulted with a lawyer to make sure I understood my rights and responsibilities. The house was legally mine, purchased, through assumption of debt and continued investment. I owed my family nothing, legally or morally, though I suspected they would see things differently. The night before the party, I barely slept. I kept running through different scenarios, imagining their faces when I revealed the truth. Part of me wondered if I was being too harsh, if there was some middle ground that would allow me to maintain family relationships while still asserting my worth. But then I remembered Charlotte's careless dismissal of my potential contribution to her wedding, my mother's casual mockery of my career, and my father's willingness to let me solve his problems while pretending they didn't exist. Arrived at the party an hour early, ostensibly to help with final preparations, but really to position myself for what was coming. The backyard looked magnificent, transformed by professional decorating into something worthy of a magazine spread. Guests began arriving promptly at 6, and within an hour, the party was in full swing. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, watching my family in their element. Dad worked the room like the successful businessman he used to be, telling stories and laughing with old friends who had no idea how dramatically his circumstances had changed. Mom held court near the appetizer table, accepting compliments on the house and the party as if she'd personally funded every detail. Charlotte and James posed for endless photos, their happiness so radiant it was almost painful to watch. Everyone seemed to be having a wonderful time in the house that I owned, eating food that I'd indirectly paid for, celebrating an engagement that would lead to a wedding funded by the sale of my property. The irony was so thick I could taste it. Around 8:30, James called for everyone's attention. He and Charlotte stood on the small stage that had been set up for the band, both beaming with joy and champagne confidence. The crowd gathered around, phones out to capture the moment. "Charlotte and I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," James began, his arm around his fiancée's waist. "Your support means the world to us as we start this new chapter of our lives. We also want to thank my incredible parents," Charlotte added, blowing a kiss toward Mom and Dad. They've given us such a beautiful celebration tonight, and they're being so generous with the wedding planning. We're so lucky to have family who will do anything for us. The crowd applauded appreciatively. I stood near the back, my heart pounding so hard I wondered if people could hear it. This was my moment. This was when I stopped being invisible. But before I could move, Mom stepped forward and took the microphone. Thank you, sweetheart. Your father and I are just so happy to see you with someone who loves you as much as James does. She paused, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. And we're excited to share that we've made a big decision to help make your wedding dreams come true. We've decided to sell the house. The crowd gasped and applauded. Someone shouted, "How generous!" while others nodded approvingly at such parental sacrifice. It's a big step, Dad added, taking the microphone from his wife. But Charlotte's happiness is worth more than any house. We're planning to use the proceeds to give her the wedding she's always dreamed of, plus help her and James buy their first home together. More applause. Charlotte was crying happy tears, while James looked appropriately grateful and humble. Mom and Dad basked in the admiration of their guests, the picture of selfless parents making the ultimate sacrifice for their daughter's happiness. I felt something snap inside my chest. The careful control I'd maintained for 5 years, the quiet acceptance of their casual cruelty, the willingness to remain invisible while they took credit for everything I'd provided, it all shattered at once. I pushed through the crowd toward the stage, my prepared speech forgotten in favor of raw truth. Actually, I said loudly enough to cut through the congratulations and conversations, you can't sell the house. The crowd turned toward me with curious expressions. Mom looked confused, Dad slightly annoyed at the interruption, and Charlotte, embarrassed by her sister's sudden outburst. Maya, sweetie, what do you mean? Mom asked with forced patience, clearly trying to manage an awkward situation in front of their guests. I stepped closer to the stage, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet backyard. I mean, you can't sell a house you don't own. The guys' confusion on their faces was almost comical. Dad stepped forward, his businessman persona kicking in to handle what he obviously assumed was some sort of misunderstanding. Maya, I think you're confused. This is our house. We've lived here for 15 years. You lived here for 15 years, I corrected. But you haven't owned it for the past 3 years. I do. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the hired musicians stopped playing, sensing something dramatic was unfolding. That's impossible, Charlotte said with a nervous laugh. Maya, you're scaring people. I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder I'd prepared. I have the deed right here. The house was transferred to my name when I refinanced the mortgage 3 years ago. The mortgage that I've been paying for the past 5 years. The mortgage that you would have defaulted on if I hadn't stepped in when Dad's business failed. I could see the exact moment when the implications hit each of them. Dad's face went pale, Mom's mouth fell open, and Charlotte looked like she'd been slapped. That's not possible, Mom whispered. It's not only possible, it's documented. I opened the folder and pulled out bank statements, payment records, and the deed. 5 years ago, Dad was 3 weeks away from foreclosure. I've been making every mortgage payment since then, plus property taxes, plus major repairs, plus the kitchen renovation you insisted on, Mom, and the roof replacement after the storm 2 years ago. I held up each document as I spoke, my voice growing stronger with each revelation. The new furnace? That was me. Charlotte's car down payment? Me. Dad's credit card bills? Also me. This party you're all enjoying? Technically, I'm hosting it, since it's being held at my house. The crowd had gone completely silent. Phones that had been documenting the engagement celebration were now capturing something entirely different. I could see people recording, and part of me hoped they were. Let the world see what happened when the invisible daughter finally demanded to be seen. Maya, Dad started, but I cut him off. I'm not finished. I turned to address the crowd directly. For 5 years, I've listened to jokes about my boring job and my lack of contribution to this family. At every gathering, I've heard about how lucky it is that Charlotte got the creative genes, how unfortunate it is that I ended up so practical and dull. Do you know what's really unfortunate? That the person keeping this family afloat has been treated like an embarrassment. I could see Charlotte's friends recording everything on their phones. Someone in the back was definitely live streaming. Good. Let everyone see this. Charlotte, you announced that I couldn't possibly contribute to your wedding because government salaries aren't generous enough. But I've been contributing to your entire lifestyle for 5 years. The utilities you never thought about? I pay them. The property taxes that keep you from losing the house? I pay them. The mortgage that would have resulted in foreclosure? I pay that too. Charlotte's face had gone from pale to red. Maya, stop. You're ruining everything. I'm ruining everything? I'm not the one who decided to sell someone else's house to fund my wedding. I'm not the one who spent 5 years taking credit for sacrifices I never made. I'm not the one who built a lifestyle on someone else's invisible labor. I turned back to the crowd, many of whom were looking uncomfortable but unable to look away from the spectacle. You want to know what's really funny? Everyone keeps talking about how generous my parents are, how they're sacrificing their house for Charlotte's happiness. But they're not sacrificing anything. They're trying to sell an asset they don't own to fund a lifestyle they haven't earned. Maya, please, Mom said, stepping toward me with tears in her eyes. Can we discuss this privately? We've had 5 years to discuss this privately, Mom. 5 years where you could have acknowledged what I was doing for this family. 5 years where you could have treated me like I mattered. Instead, you made jokes about my career while that career was saving your house. I could see James pulling Charlotte aside, whispering urgently in her ear. Some of the guests were starting to leave, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding in front of them. Others seemed transfixed, unable to tear themselves away from the real-time destruction of what they'd thought was a perfect family. The house is mine, I continued, my voice carrying clearly across the backyard. The deed is in my name. The mortgage is in my name, and the decision about what happens to it is mine to make. And I've decided that I'm done subsidizing people who treat me like I'm invisible. Dad finally found his voice. Maya, if you've been helping with the house payments, we can work something out. We can pay you back. I laughed, a sound with no humor in it. Pay me back with what, Dad? You haven't had a job in 5 years. Your business failed, remember? The business failure that started this whole situation that I've been quietly managing while you pretended everything was fine. The truth was spreading through the crowd like ripples in a pond. I could see people whispering to each other, checking their phones, sharing the videos that were already being posted online. Charlotte's perfect engagement party was becoming something entirely different. Here's what's going to happen, I announced, my auditor training kicking in to organize the chaos into a clear plan. I'm selling the house, not to fund Charlotte's wedding, but because I'm done with this family dynamic. I'm done being taken for granted. I'm done being mocked, and I'm done pretending that I owe you anything more than I've already given. Charlotte was crying now, her perfect makeup running down her cheeks. Maya, you can't do this to me. This is my engagement party. This is supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Then maybe you shouldn't have built your happiness on someone else's invisible sacrifice, I replied. Maybe you should have thought about treating your sister like she mattered before you needed something from her. I could see James calculating behind his eyes, probably wondering what this meant for their wedding plans and the down payment they'd been counting on. The mercenary look on his face told me everything I needed to know about his feelings for Charlotte beyond her family's apparent wealth. You're destroying our family, Mom said, her voice breaking. I'm not destroying anything, Mom. I'm just stopping, pretending that we had a family where I mattered. You destroyed that years ago when you decided I was too boring to deserve basic respect. I gathered my papers and tucked them back into my folder. The documentation had served its purpose. No one could deny the facts now. The truth was out, recorded and shared, impossible to take back. "The party's over," I announced to the crowd. "Thank you all for witnessing the end of my family's ability to take credit for my work. Charlotte, James, I wish you the best with your wedding planning. I'm sure you'll figure something out." I walked toward the gate, leaving behind the stunned silence and the house that had been both my burden and my secret power for 5 years. Behind me, I could hear the chaos beginning as guests started asking questions and Charlotte's sobs grew louder. My phone was buzzing before I'd even reached my car. Text messages, missed calls, social media notifications. The videos were already online, already being shared and commented on. "Revenge accountant destroys family at engagement party" was trending on Twitter before I'd driven 3 blocks. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt empty, like I'd been holding my breath for 5 years and had finally exhaled. The weight in my chest was gone, but it had left a hollow space behind. The next few days were a whirlwind. The videos from the engagement party had gone viral, with millions of views and thousands of comments. Most people were on my side, calling me a revenge accountant and praising me for standing up to family abuse. Others thought I'd been too harsh, that family issues should be handled privately. I didn't care about the public opinion, but I did find some validation in reading comments from other people who'd been the invisible supporters in their own families. Messages from daughters who'd paid for their siblings' education while being treated like the family failure. From sons who'd supported their parents while being constantly criticized. From spouses who'd funded lifestyles while being told they weren't contributing enough. My story had become their story, and knowing I wasn't alone in the experience helped ease some of the guilt I was fighting about the public nature of my revelation. Charlotte tried calling me dozens of times before, sending a series of increasingly desperate text messages. The wedding was off. James had broken up with her 2 days after the party, citing complicated family dynamics that he didn't want to inherit. The reality was probably that he'd been counting on her family's money and had discovered she was actually just the broke daughter of broke parents. Mom left voicemails that ranged from angry to pleading to confused. She seemed genuinely baffled by my reaction, unable to understand how their treatment of me had been problematic. In her mind, they'd been a normal family dealing with normal challenges, and my financial help had been a generous but not particularly noteworthy contribution. Dad's messages were different. He didn't try to justify or explain. He just apologized over and over for letting me carry a burden that should have been his. He admitted that he'd known I was helping more than I'd let on, but he'd been too ashamed and depressed to acknowledge it directly. I didn't respond to any of them immediately. I needed time to process what I'd done and what came next. The house sold quickly. The real estate market was strong, and the property had been well maintained thanks to my investments over the years. After paying off the remaining mortgage balance and covering selling costs, I cleared just over $400,000. I used part of the money to buy a condo in a different part of town, something modern and efficient that required minimal maintenance. The rest went into investments and savings, building the financial security I'd compromised by supporting my family for so long. The media attention brought unexpected opportunities. A literary agent reached out about writing a book on financial abuse. 2 different production companies wanted to option my story for movies or television shows. Several financial planning firms offered me consulting positions, and I was invited to speak at conferences about family dynamics and money. I accepted the speaking engagements, but declined most of the other opportunities. I wasn't interested in being famous for my family's dysfunction. I just wanted to build a life where my contributions were valued and my worth wasn't measured by my willingness to remain invisible. 3 months after the engagement party, I ran into Dad at a coffee shop near his new apartment. He looked older, thinner, but also somehow lighter. The crushing weight of his financial failure seemed to have lifted now that it was no longer a secret. "Maya," he said, approaching my table hesitantly. Could I sit down? I nodded, curious about what he had to say, now that enough time had passed for the initial shock to wear off. I've been in therapy, he said without preamble, trying to understand how I let things get so bad. How I let you carry everything alone while I pretended it wasn't happening. And what have you learned? That I was a coward. That I let my shame about failing make me complicit in your family's treatment of you. That you deserved better from all of us, but especially from me. I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or self-pity, but found only genuine remorse. What about Mom and Charlotte? Your mother is struggling to understand why you're so angry. She genuinely believes she was a good mother who supported both her daughters equally. The therapy is helping her see things differently, but it's slow progress. And Charlotte? Charlotte is angry at you, at me, at the situation. She's had to move back in with your mother, and she's working retail while she figures out what comes next. The breakup hit her hard, and I think she's finally realizing that her lifestyle wasn't as secure as she thought. I felt a pang of sympathy. For my sister, followed immediately by irritation at my own reaction. Charlotte was experiencing the natural consequences of building her life on other people's labor. Her struggle was the result of her choices, not my cruelty. Are you trying to make me feel guilty, Dad? No, he said quickly. God, no. Maya, what you did at the party was the bravest thing I've ever seen anyone do. You told the truth when the rest of us had been living a lie for years. I just wanted you to know that some of us are finally seeing clearly. We talked for another hour. Dad told me about his new job, a lower-level position at a construction firm that barely covered his expenses but gave him purpose again. He was living in a studio apartment and taking the bus to work, experiencing financial constraints he hadn't faced since his 20s. It's humbling, he admitted, but it's also honest. I know exactly where I stand now, and I'm working to build something real instead of pretending I still had something I'd already lost. I found myself respecting this version of my father more than I had the man who'd let me solve his problems while maintaining the facade of success. This dad was broken down and built back up, authentic in a way he hadn't been since his business failed. We started meeting for coffee once a week, not to rebuild the family relationship we'd never really had, but to construct something new and honest. He never asked about my finances or hinted that I should help him again. Instead, he talked about his work, his therapy, and his slow process of learning to live within his actual means. Mom and Charlotte were different stories. Mom continued to believe that the family's financial situation had been a temporary setback that we all should have weathered together. She couldn't understand why I'd chosen to embarrass the family instead of working things out privately. The concept that I'd been subsidizing their lifestyle rather than just helping out during a rough patch seemed beyond her comprehension. Charlotte's anger was more understandable, but equally impossible to bridge. She blamed me for the end of her engagement, the loss of her lifestyle, and her current financial struggles. In her mind, I'd had the power to maintain the status quo and had chosen destruction instead. She couldn't see that the status quo had been built on my invisible labor and their willingness to ignore it. I didn't try to reconcile with either of them. The family that had existed before the engagement party had been based on an unsustainable dynamic. I had no interest in rebuilding relationships with people who thought I owed them continued sacrifice without acknowledgement or appreciation. Instead, I focused on building the life I'd deferred for 5 years while managing their crisis. I took vacation days for the first time in years, traveling to places I'd only dreamed about while my discretionary income went to their mortgage payments. I went back to school for my MBA, something I'd postponed because I hadn't wanted to take, on debt while supporting my family. The viral fame faded, as internet fame always does, but the opportunities it created continued to grow. I wrote a book about recognizing and escaping family financial abuse, drawing on both my personal experience and my professional knowledge of financial systems. It became a bestseller, resonating with thousands of people who'd found themselves in similar situations. I started a consulting practice, helping families navigate financial crises without creating destructive dynamics. My experience on both sides of the equation, as the financial professional and as the exploited family member, gave me unique insight into how these situations developed and how they could be resolved more equitably. A year after the engagement party, I was invited to speak at a conference on family wealth management. As I stood on the stage, looking out at an audience of financial professionals, I thought about how different my life had become. 12 months earlier, I'd been the invisible daughter whose expertise was dismissed and whose contributions were ignored. Now I was being paid substantial fees to share that expertise with people who treated my knowledge as valuable. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd had to destroy my family relationships to be valued for the same skills and knowledge they'd been benefiting from all along, but the destruction had been worth it. For the first time in my adult life, I was living authentically, in relationships where my worth was recognized and my contributions were appreciated. I never did attend Charlotte's eventual wedding, a small ceremony she managed to pull together 2 years later with a different fiancé and a much more modest budget. I wasn't invited, which saved us both the awkwardness of declining or accepting. According to Dad, it was a lovely event that she actually seemed to enjoy more than her previous plans for an elaborate celebration. Mom and Charlotte never understood why I'd chosen to end our family relationships rather than work things out privately. They saw my public revelation as unnecessarily cruel, an escalation that destroyed more than it resolved. But they never grasped that the family relationships they wanted to preserve had been built on my willingness to remain invisible. Once I refused to accept that role, those relationships couldn't survive in their original form. Some families might have found a way to rebuild on a healthier foundation. Others might have worked through the resentment and established new boundaries that respected everyone's contributions. But our family had been too damaged by years of taking my sacrifice for granted while mocking the career that made it possible. The morning I moved into my new condo, I stood in the empty living room and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. There were no hidden mortgage payments to worry about, no family members whose financial crises might become my emergency, no dinner parties where my career would be dismissed while my bank account subsidized the wine being served. I was finally visible in my own life, the protagonist of my own story, instead of the invisible supporting character in everyone else's drama. It had cost me my family relationships, but it had gained me something more valuable: the knowledge that I would never again accept being treated as less than I was worth. The house I'd secretly owned and publicly lost had been more than just a financial investment. It had been a symbol of my willingness to sacrifice my own needs for people who didn't value my sacrifice. Selling it and walking away had been more than just a real estate transaction. It had been a declaration that my worth wasn't negotiable. 3 years later, I still receive occasional messages from family members wanting to reconnect. Christmas cards from Mom with handwritten notes about missing the family we used to be. Birthday texts from Charlotte with updates about her life and hints that she's ready to move past our misunderstanding. Even some extended family members have reached out, having heard the story secondhand and wanting to bridge the gap. I respond politely, but don't pursue deeper connections. The family we used to be was built on my willingness to remain invisible while they took credit for stability. I provided. I have no interest in returning to that dynamic, and they've shown no real understanding of why it was problematic. Instead, I've built chosen family relationships with people who see and value me for who I am. Colleagues who respect my expertise, friends who appreciate my humor and insight, romantic partners who are attracted to my strength rather than threatened by it. My story has become part of a larger conversation about family dynamics and financial abuse. I receive emails from people around the world who've recognized their own situations in my experience. Adult children supporting parents who take their help for granted. siblings covering family expenses while being treated like the family failure, spouses funding lifestyles while being told they don't contribute enough. The response has shown me that invisible supporters exist in families everywhere. People whose labor and sacrifice enable others' lifestyles while their contributions are dismissed or ignored. My very public refusal to remain invisible has given others permission to examine their own situations and demand better treatment. I've learned that being visible isn't just about being seen by others. It's about seeing yourself clearly and refusing to accept less than you deserve. For years, I convinced myself that my family's treatment of me was acceptable because they didn't know the extent of my contributions. But their ignorance was willful, and my secrecy was enabling. The truth was always there for anyone who cared to look. Dad could have asked how I was able to help so consistently. Mom could have wondered where the money for repairs and upgrades was coming from. Charlotte could have questioned how her broke. Parents were able to maintain their lifestyle. They didn't ask because they didn't want to know. Knowing would have required acknowledging my sacrifice and treating me with corresponding respect. It was easier to accept my help while maintaining their dismissive attitude toward my worth. When I finally forced them to see the truth, they reacted with anger and denial because the revelation required them to fundamentally reassess not just our family dynamics, but their own characters. People who take advantage of others while mocking them aren't just ungrateful, they're actively cruel. Facing that reality about themselves was more than they could handle. But I wasn't responsible for managing their self-perception anymore. I wasn't responsible for making my contributions small enough to keep them comfortable. I wasn't responsible for staying invisible so they could continue believing they were good people who'd never hurt anyone. I was responsible for valuing myself enough to demand that others do the same. And when they couldn't or wouldn't, I was responsible for walking away. The invisible daughter is gone, replaced by a woman who knows her worth and insists that others recognize it too. It took destroying everything I thought I wanted to build everything I actually needed. And given the choice again, knowing the cost, I would make the same decision every time. Because being seen is worth more than being needed by people who refuse to see you. Being valued is worth more than being useful to people who mock what they use. And being respected is worth more than being related to people who treat you like you're disposable. I learned that the most powerful revenge isn't hurting the people who hurt you. It's refusing to let them continue hurting you. It's stepping into the light and claiming the visibility you've always deserved. It's saying, I matter, and meaning it regardless of whether anyone else agrees. 5 years ago, I was the family's invisible financial backbone, supporting people who treated me like a punchline. Today, I'm a successful author, consultant, and speaker who helps other people escape similar situations. The skills they mocked have become the foundation of a career that brings me recognition, respect, and substantial income. The house is gone, sold to a young family who will build their own memories in the space where I learned both the cost of invisibility and the power of refusing to accept it. The mortgage payments that once felt like stones in my chest have been replaced by investment returns that fund the life I actually want to live. And the family that once took my sacrifice for granted has learned what life looks like when the invisible daughter finally becomes visible and walks away. That's the real revenge I've discovered. Not the dramatic public confrontation, though that felt good in the moment. The real revenge is building a life so much better than what you had before that you're grateful for the loss that made it possible. I am no longer the invisible daughter. I am the woman who refused to remain unseen, and that woman has a much better life than the one she left behind.